My name is Achim Czerny. I'm a professor at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University Department of Logistics and Maritime Studies. In a previous video, I explained the airline's incentives to promote CORSIA versus the EU ETS. I highlighted that CORSIA is first, less ambitious in terms of the environmental goals, and second, that it is much cheaper than the EU ETS. One may wonder, why is it that CORSIA is so much cheaper than the EU ETS? This is the topic of this video. The reason why I qualified CORSIA as cheap is that environmental efforts can be bought from others at a much lower price under CORSIA compared to the EU ETS. The price for a ton of CO2 is up to $17 for CORSIA, while the corresponding price is minimum €60 for the EU ETS. After publishing the last video, I thought that it would be important to also explain why there is such a huge price difference between the two systems. It's not difficult to understand. Consider the EU ETS. Over the years, the yearly emissions went down from more than 2,000 million tons of CO2 to around 1,000 million tons of CO2 today. This means that over the last 20 years, European carbon emissions have been cut in half. Under the EU ETS, firms have to answer a fundamental question for themselves. Do I emit carbon, or should I decide not to emit carbon? Assume they decide to emit carbon. If firms emit, then they can either use up their existing allowances or buy allowances from others. If firms do not emit, then they don't have to buy allowances from others, or, importantly, they can even earn revenues by selling their allowances to others. The price for buying and selling allowances is up to €100 historically. The point is that if firms, airlines, buy allowances, the system ensures that others cannot use the same permit anymore. In this sense, there can be trade, but the trade would be such that achieving the environmental goals is guaranteed by the EU ETS system. How about CORSIA? Remember, there is a cap on the airline emissions, which is 85% of the 2019 airline emissions. What do airlines do if reducing carbon emissions would mean that they would lose a lot of revenue by reducing cargo and not flying passengers? One thing they can do is buying CORSIA-eligible emission units. Here's an example. A region somewhere in the world can sell emission units if it promises to leave tropical forests untouched. Deforestation and forest degradation are important sources for carbon emissions. Therefore, in principle, this could be effective in helping to protect the global climate. But does it really help protect the climate? Perhaps it would, if without CORSIA, the regions would indeed decide to destroy the forest. In this case, the CORSIA system really helps protecting the climate because forests store carbon. If, however, the forest would be protected from destruction even without CORSIA, this would violate the condition of so-called additionality. This is because in this case, CORSIA would not generate any additional environmental protection. Here's another however. If the transaction would not be honored and the forest would be destructed despite the CORSIA transaction, CORSIA obviously would also not generate any additional environmental protection. Let me say a few words about additionality. For me, as an economist, additionality is similar to the concept of causality. You do one thing, in this case pay to protect the forest, and this causes something, in this case forest protection. Proving causality is something we economists are obsessed with. Here's the issue. We're often trying to convince others of causal relationships and mostly fail to do so. For this reason, we understand that it is extremely difficult to prove causality and convince others that a certain relationship is really causal. This makes me believe that additionality in the context of climate protections is hard to prove as well. Hard means that even if someone honestly, truly tries to find out whether something is additional, methodologically, this is extremely demanding and difficult. What is the consequence? The worry is that, in effect, CORSIA eligible emission units might be cheap because there are incentives to sell greening activities that do not have a real impact. But be aware that this is not the only explanation for the existence of cheap carbon emission efforts under CORSIA. It is important to remember that CORSIA is a global scheme. This is a big advantage. This means that CORSIA could be cheap because it takes advantage of a much larger pool of opportunities, strategies to reduce carbon emissions at low cost. The EU ETS as a regional scheme is more limited in what it can do to protect the climate at low cost. The truth behind the low prices for CORSIA eligible emission units is likely a combination of two effects: low quality protection and real protection at low cost. My understanding is that there have been studies which indicated that the quality of CORSIA eligible units is questionable. Even if so, there can be substantial benefits in stepping up efforts and improving the CORSIA approach simply for the fact that it is global, providing huge opportunities to protect the climate at low cost. Here's another thing that airlines can do to reduce carbon emissions. They can buy sustainable aviation fuel and get so-called CORSIA-eligible fuels to reduce their offsetting obligations. The SAF topic can become arbitrarily technical, and I'm not an engineer. For me, as an economist, it is sufficient to understand that there are two important dimensions in which SAFs can be differentiated. The first is the feedstock or the ingredients which are used to produce SAF. For instance, are the ingredients such that there is a rivalry between using them for producing SAF or food? That's one issue. The second is the potential for reducing carbon emissions. In the extreme, SAF use can reduce emissions by close to 100%. SAF use will typically reduce carbon emissions by less than 100% though. The use of some SAFs would reduce carbon emissions, for instance, by less than 50%. How about the EU ETS versus CORSIA when it comes to SAF use? The EU ETS SAF requirements are considered stricter compared to the CORSIA SAF requirements. This provides another explanation for why CORSIA is cheaper than the EU ETS. Altogether, the EU ETS is more costly, but also more effective in climate protection. Because it's a regional scheme, it however forgoes of some of the potential to effectively protect the climate at the lowest cost. Anyway, and most importantly, both schemes, CORSIA and the EU ETS, contribute to achieving the global climate goals.